welcome back. It is now time for session 2. The title of this session is The Progressive Challenge of the Early 1900s. Moderating this panel would be Christopher DeMuth. Mr. DeMuth is a distinguished fellow at the Hudson Institute. Many know him from the American Enterprise Institute, which he led as president from 1986 to 2008. Mr. DeMuth's career in Washington began as a staff assistant to President Richard Nixon, working for Daniel P. Moynihan. During the Reagan administration, Mr. DeMuth was executive director of the Presidential Task Force on Regulatory Relief. He is a trustee of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Fund. Please join me in welcoming Mr. DeMuth and our panelists to the stage.
The ideas and ideals that guided Coolidge the president were products not only of his no-nonsense Vermont upbringing, studies at Amherst, and training in the law. They were also a result of his on-the-job experience as mayor of Northampton, president of the Massachusetts Senate, and Massachusetts lieutenant governor and governor. During Coolidge's coming of age as a practicing politician, American politics, including his own Republican Party, were seized by a new impulse that called itself progressivism. The progressive movement championed many great causes and achieved some of them, including women's suffrage and a host of private voluntary welfare initiatives and institutions that included Grace Goodhue Coolidge's lifelong project of the education of the deaf. But when it came to government, progressivism sought to cast aside traditional constitutional principles of separation of powers and limited government, and to replace them with activist, headstrong, supposedly scientific government that would reform society from top to bottom and remake human nature itself. Progressivism was a clever brand name. It appealed to Americans' innate commitment to progress that harkened back to our revolutionary founding, even as it sought to repeal the works of that founding. It appealed for a time to Coolidge, and it plays a large role in American politics even today. At a 1924 press conference, then President Coolidge, now a seasoned political pro and a confirmed and emphatic conservative, said this: "Sometimes, if a person is well thought of, he is called a progressive. As a matter of fact, all the political parties are progressive. I can't conceive of a party existing for any length of time that wasn't progressive, or of leadership being effective that wasn't progressive." This was Coolidge's deadpan way of saying that the principles of the Declaration and Constitution and their continued application in the world of the 20th century had every claim to be on the side of progress in the customary all-American sense of that word. This morning we will hear from 3 accomplished historians and practitioners on the evolution of Calvin Coolidge's thought and practice at the time of rising progressivism. Their biographies are in your program, but let me highlight that George Nash is the author of several foundational works on 20th century conservatism. Garland Tucker is author of The High Tide of American Conservatism, focusing on the presidential election of 1924. And Christopher Cox, during his 7 terms as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, was a budget hawk of Coolidgian dimensions. We will begin with George Nass. George?
Thank you. In 1906, Calvin Coolidge was elected to a seat in the Massachusetts House of Representatives. For all but one of the next 14 years, he held elective office, culminating in 2 terms as governor. Coolidge's rise to prominence occurred during the Progressive Era, a time of militant reform movements and political ferment that fractured the Republican Party, a time also of seething labor unrest and enormous immigration. In Massachusetts, a heavily industrialized state with many factories, pardon me, nearly 1/3 of the population in 1910 was foreign-born. How did Coolidge, an undemonstrative Yankee, steer so successfully through these choppy political seas? Clearly, his probity, devotion to duty, and unusual ability to win the trust of ordinary people across ethnic and party lines contributed greatly to his appeal at the polls. In my remarks today, I wish to identify 2 other factors, both of them ideological. First, Coolidge survived during the Progressive Era because in many ways he was a progressive himself. In 1907 and 1908, for example, State Representative Coolidge favored women's suffrage and direct election of U.S. senators well before the constitutional amendments were enacted. Mindful, no doubt, of the considerable number of working-class voters in his district, he supported legislation requiring 1 day's rest in 7 for workers, and other bills intended to ease the burdens of working men. He vigorously endorsed an anti-monopoly bill that it would have prohibited business behemoths like Standard Oil from selling their products below cost in an attempt to ruin their small competitors. A few years later, when a dangerous strike broke out among foreign-born workers in the textile mills of Lawrence, Massachusetts, Coolidge, now a state senator, was appointed chairman of a legislative committee on conciliation to bring the 2 sides together. After much effort, he and his colleagues resolved the dispute on terms that gave the strikers much of what they wanted, and won Coolidge plaudits for fair-mindedness. He was no stand-patter, a socialist opponent admitted. Indeed, Coolidge, in his autobiography, declared that his record in the state legislature had been, and I quote his words, that of a liberal. And so it went as he climbed the ladder in Massachusetts politics. In 1919, as a new governor, he supported a landmark bill mandating that no woman or minor in Massachusetts could be employed for more than 48 hours a week. Many manufacturing interests strenuously opposed him. He signed the bill anyway. Later that year, and again in 1920, when he was still governor, he approved a host of other progressive legislative measures. This brings us to the second ideological ingredient in Coolidge's recipe for political success in that era. His progressivism, though genuine and persistent, was tempered by his innate circumspection and growing unease about progressive excess. In 1910, he remarked to his father that it is more important to kill bad bills than to pass good ones, a theme to which he returned in the years ahead. In 1912, although sensitive to the plight of the mill workers in Lawrence, he disliked their radical leaders who advocated an overthrow of the capitalist system. They were socialists and anarchists, he complained privately, who were bent on destroying, and I quote Coolidge again, destroying all authority, whether of any church or government. When Theodore Roosevelt bolted from the GOP in 1912 and campaigned for president as the nominee of the new Progressive Party, Coolidge, always a steadfast Republican, remained loyal to President Taft. He was incensed when Roosevelt endorsed in principle the recall of judges by popular vote. To Coolidge, speaking at a Republican rally, this was nothing less than an assault on the independence of the judiciary, and it made the election of 1912, in his words, the most important since the Civil War. He was happy when Roosevelt was defeated. Coolidge was not pleased, however, by the drift of things in Massachusetts. By early 1914, he was alarmed by what he later called a spirit of radicalism arising in his state, a spirit manifested in bills in the legislature aimed, as he put it, at impairing the property of employers. In his inaugural address as president of the state Senate in 1914, he forcefully appealed to what he later described as the conservative spirit of the people. He titled his speech, "Have Faith in Massachusetts." It was an eloquent case for a prudentially conservative approach to government that was slowly becoming ascendant in his mind. Nevertheless, and we must not forget this, Coolidge's support for progressive social welfare legislation did not cease in 1914. It continued as long as he held state office. The Coolidge who announced as governor in January 1920 that it was now time to, in his words, conserve and retrench rather than to reform, was the same governor who, in the ensuing months, approved a slew of new progressive legislation. This brings me, in closing, to the fateful year 1919, one of the most violent and strife-ridden years in all of American history. The specter of Bolshevik revolution abroad and of violent strikes and criminal anarchy at home greatly troubled Governor Coolidge. As the progressive tide receded and more radical assaults on the social order emerged, the experience of combating them shook him to the core of his being and brought his fundamentally conservative beliefs in the rule of law and ordered freedom to center stage. Without the harrowing upheavals of 1919 and the Boston police strike that made him a national figure, Coolidge, I think, would probably be remembered today as a cautious progressive, an incrementalist, a practitioner of what has been called the politics of prudence. For many years, progressive and conservative beliefs coexisted in his mind. But when revolutionary challenges to the American system of government erupted after World War I, his rhetoric of conservatism became more conspicuous and assertive. It was this side of Coolidge that defined him ever after, beginning in 1920, when Americans returned to normalcy and left the progressive era behind. Thank you.
Dr. Nash, thank you very much. Garland Tucker, if you please.
Today we assume that political parties, stand for certain things, and those positions are permanent. For example, we assume that the Democrats are the progressives and the Republicans are the conservatives. But history isn't like that. Political impulses make themselves felt, but as I'll try to show you this morning, it's almost an historical accident which party carries the banner for which impulse. And also that events and men have played a role in that. President McKinley played a role, Theodore Roosevelt played a role, Calvin Coolidge played a role. And their personal fates, when they lived and when they died, also played a role. Our example is the progressive movement. From the earliest days of the Republic, Jefferson's philosophy and vision of limited government had competed with Hamilton's advocacy of a strong, more centralized government. As the country developed into a more capitalistic, industrialized, and urban nation after the Civil War, some Americans began to question whether the old Jeffersonian ideals were sufficient. In the 1880s, American progressivism arose in response to what some viewed as the need for a stronger government, a government to protect individuals from capitalism, not a Hamiltonian government to promote capitalism. As one historian has written, quote, progressivism began as a series of grassroots, angry, unorganized campaigns by consumers and taxpayers to challenge the legitimacy of privilege and concentrated wealth and power, end quote. This burgeoning movement was bipartisan. There were Western Republican farmers, there were Southern Democratic tenant farmers, and there were urban industrial workers and immigrants who were largely Democrats. In 1896, just as Coolidge was graduating from Amherst, the progressive movement burst onto the national scene at the Democratic National Convention. Progressives, many from Coolidge's family party, the Republicans, unleashed a stinging backlash against the conservatism of President Grover Cleveland. The progressive populist from Nebraska, William Jennings Bryan, stampeded the Democratic Convention with his famous Cross of Gold speech. In fact, while at college, Coolidge had actually debated gold. It was a big issue at that time. Bryan articulated the progressive impulse for citizens to band together, strengthen government, and confront big business. Capitalism was the problem and government was the answer. William McKinley defended conservatism and as a Republican twice defeated Bryan. But McKinley was killed by an assassin, making a near unknown the president and leader of Coolidge's party, Theodore Roosevelt. When TR won on his own in 1904, Coolidge's party, the GOP, had become the Progressive Party. By the election of 1912, when Coolidge was running for state offices, progressivism led by the GOP had totally transformed the American political landscape. And the idea was still in political play. Roosevelt's successor, William Howard Taft, had done his utmost to uphold TR's progressive policies, but by 1912, Taft was seen as almost a quasi-conservative. The Democratic opponent, Woodrow Wilson, squarely positioned the Democrats in the progressive camp, and the third-party candidate in 1912, Theodore Roosevelt, was running further to the left on the Bull Moose progressive platform. Yet even further to the left was Eugene Debs, who campaigned as an outright socialist. As William Allen White has suggested, quote, never before have we been so nearly one people with one dominant political ideal, end quote. It was indeed, 1912 was indeed the high tide of progressivism. With the Taft-Roosevelt split within the GOP in 1912, Wilson gained the White House with only 42% of the vote, but claimed a progressive mandate. As historian Paul Johnson has written about the progressive platform of 1912, quote, the state was seen as a knight in shining armor, coming to the rescue of the poor and the weak and the victimized, and doing with objective benevolence what otherwise would be done selfishly by greedy aggregators of private wealth, end quote. Coolidge watched all this. By 1910, Coolidge himself was, in William Allen White's words, quote, a more than half persuaded to be a Rooseveltian progressive, end quote. And with his party in Massachusetts law, Coolidge signed off on and even led passage of progressive laws, antitrust laws against theaters, and passage of the amendments to the Constitution. Coolidge gradually began to discern the incompatibility of his own growing conservatism with this new progressivism. As he prepared to assume the presidency of the Massachusetts State Senate in 1913 and then lieutenant governor and governor, he considered it all and doubted the progressive impulse. This was the period that he wrote to his father that it is more important to kill a bad bill than to pass a good one. Coolidge later described this observation, quote, "It appeared to me that a spirit of radicalism prevailed, which, unless checked, was likely to prove very destructive," end quote. He further defined this spirit of radicalism as a dangerous notion that somehow the government should be blamed, quote, and this is his quote, should be blamed because everybody else was not prosperous, end quote. It's interesting to note that Theodore Roosevelt was the widely acknowledged front-runner for the GOP nomination in 1920. But Theodore Roosevelt died unexpectedly in 1919. Had he lived, TR would probably have won the nomination and the election, and the GOP could conceivably have become the Progressive Party. Had this happened, this would have put Coolidge in a fix. He was, by the late 1910s, a more serious conservative, and so was his party. In 1920, the GOP made a decision. It would be the party of conservatism, even if it meant seeing a splinter move off and form another progressive party again. Normalcy, the policy of common sense, would rule. The selection of Coolidge as vice presidential candidate was in part a response to the demand for a conservative GOP. In the 1920 election, Vice President nominee Coolidge was articulating his conservative vision with clarity, quote, "In a free republic, a great government is the product of a great people. They will look to themselves rather than to the government for success," end quote. He was rejecting progressivism. In 1919, TR died. Coolidge determined he would govern, in Paul Johnson's words, as, quote, "the most internally consistent and single-minded of U.S. presidents," end quote. The 1920s, under Harding's and Coolidge's leadership, was a decade of conservative ascendancy, but the battle with progressivism continued in both parties. In the Democratic Party, the fight during the 1920s was exceedingly acrimonious and culminated in the deadlock convention of 1924. After 103 ballots that year, the exhausted Democrats nominated a compromise conservative candidate, John W. Davis. It was interesting to note that Davis, like Coolidge, had begun his political career as a progressive, while progressivism was gaining wide acceptance. He had ably served under Wilson, but like Coolidge, Davis grew increasingly conservative. By 1924, Davis was as conservative as Coolidge, which prompted the third-party candidate of Robert La Follette. La Follette was a Republican, and his running mate was a Democrat. That was in the splinter party, the Progressive Party. An important aspect of Coolidge's legacy was the realignment of American political parties, which has continued now for 100 years. Coolidge's landslide victory in 1924 established the Republican Party as the conservative party, while the Democrats became the Progressive Party. Shortly after Election Day, 1924, Franklin Roosevelt declared that it was, quote, "useless for the Democrats to wear the livery of the conservative," end quote. That's a lesson the Democrats have not yet forgotten. The ongoing struggle between conservatism and progressivism still bears today the imprint of Calvin Coolidge. Thank you.
Thank you, Garland. We turn now to Chris Cox. Chris?
Thank you, Chris. But by the time Coolidge took the national stage, the progressive era had run its course, and that gave him the opportunity to assess, based on real results, real world results, its successes and failures. The fundamental challenge that this presented is that progressivism in practice had diverged wildly from its aims. America, at the end of the Wilson administration, was beset with race riots, runaway inflation, violent strikes, and the suppression of civil liberties. In practice, progressive initiatives such as the income tax and prohibition were proving to have very different impacts on middle-class households than progressive theory had predicted. The income tax appeared in 1913, and it began with a relatively low top rate of 6% that applied only to the most wealthy people in America with incomes of $15 million and up, adjusted to today's dollars. But by 1920, when Coolidge ran for vice president, the 6% rate now applied all the way down to incomes of $20,000 adjusted to today's dollars. And the top rate had risen to 73%. There were 56 tax brackets. Prohibition, just as jarringly, diverged from the ideal in practice, in reality. Enforcement was far beyond the government's capabilities. Progressivism had imagined that prohibition would solve a wide variety of moral ills. It would reduce crime, it would reduce corruption, and so on. But instead of solving existing social problems, it created new ones. Even so, as you've heard, as lieutenant governor and as governor, Calvin Coolidge remained open to progressive ideals. He not only had an open mind to progressivism, but he supported many progressive causes, such as the rights of working people and the dignity of work. And he supported policies that today we think of as progressive, but that Wilson did not support, such as voting rights for women, as George mentioned. Beginning in 1907 in the Massachusetts legislature, Calvin Coolidge voted in favor of women's suffrage. In fact, Coolidge became president of the Massachusetts Senate when the incumbent president of the Senate lost his reelection because of his opposition to women's suffrage. Unlike Coolidge, Woodrow Wilson had opposed women's suffrage even at the state level, not only in 1907, but years later as governor of New Jersey and as president. Wilson did not support women's suffrage at the state level until 1915, by which time Susan B. Anthony was 10 years in the grave, dying at age 86. And Wilson didn't drop his opposition to the Susan B. Anthony Amendment until the final years of his second term in the White House. The fact that Wilson opposed women's suffrage while Coolidge supported it highlights an important distinction. Wilson's brand of progressivism came to define the movement, but he and many of the progressives that he appointed to his cabinet and his government did not include women's rights in their definition of progressive, nor did they include civil rights for Black Americans. Most progressives, Wilson among them, subscribed to academic theories that validated racial hierarchies, what historian David Southern has labeled scientific racism. It was built on elaborate intellectual constructs that drew from biology, psychology, sociology, genetics, eugenics. In fact, many of the most prominent progressives were instrumental in establishing Jim Crow in the United States. The best known progressive Democrat in Virginia, Woodrow Wilson's birthplace, was Carter Glass. Glass championed progressive causes such as higher regulation on banks, on corporations, and on railroads, but he also led the charge for segregation and for restricting the vote to white males. Glass served as Woodrow Wilson's Treasury Secretary. William Jennings Bryan, 3 times the Democratic presidential nominee during the Progressive Era and Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State, argued in a New York Times editorial that, quote, white supremacy promotes the highest welfare of both races. Dartmouth professor John Mecklin estimates that Bryan was responsible for the intellectual development of, quote, tens of thousands of devout Klansmen. Bryan spoke at the Democratic National Convention in 1924 for nearly half an hour in opposition to a resolution condemning the Ku Klux Klan. When he died in 1925, the Ku Klux Klan conducted memorial services and cross burnings for him across the country. In the cabinet as Wilson's Secretary of State, Bryan offered no objection when another Wilson cabinet member, Albert Burleson, proposed segregation for the federal bureaucracy. Wilson himself went along with the idea and defended it in public, despite the fact that prior to the Wilson administration, white and black workers had worked side by side at the same desks, and tables, and machinery for years. The progressive journalist and publisher Josephus Daniels was another white supremacist in the Wilson cabinet. He was well known for fomenting the notorious Wilmington, North Carolina riots that resulted in the deaths of 60 black Americans in one day. Daniels celebrated the result with a jubilee. Wilson made him the publicity chairman for his 1912 presidential campaign and then Secretary of the Navy. At the end of the Wilson administration, race riots across the United States were in almost every case instigated by white vigilantes attacking black men and women. Newspapers at the time described the violence as the worst since the Civil War. At a time when unions aimed to keep black people and women out, Woodrow Wilson sided with the unions. When the AFL threatened a railroad strike because railroads had hired women conductors at equal pay, the Wilson administration recommended that all women conductors be fired. In 1920, Coolidge saw what Wilsonian progressivism had wrought. He also understood the popular mood that soundly rejected the results. When he and Harding were elected, it was with the greatest popular landslide in a century. But Coolidge continued to sympathize with progressivism's highest aims, if not its past methods. He always believed that government should treat the humblest individual with the same dignity as the most exalted. He denounced selfishness. He believed that in return for government's protection of private property, the owners of private property had an obligation to use it in service of society. He called this his law of service. But ultimately, Woodrow Wilson and not Calvin Coolidge would be labeled progressive. I would say that in a very real sense, these ideals of Coolidge are the genuinely and enduringly progressive ones.
Thank you, Chris Cox, very much. I have some questions, but we had three intensely interesting presentations, and I'm wondering if our three authors have any reactions, thoughts, reflections prompted by those others on the panel.
All right. Well, I think what the papers demonstrate, particularly the two after my own, was how various progressivism was in that period. It was a period of great flux politically and ideologically. It was a period when people jumped parties. The Democrats elected a governor of historically Republican Massachusetts in 1910. He had been a Republican, became a Democrat, served 3 terms, left, went back to being a Republican again. And there are other examples like that. Teddy Roosevelt, of course, being the manifestly obvious one of someone with a party affiliation bolting that party. So what one of the themes that emerges, I think, from the two gentlemen's papers on the panel with me, is that in this period, progressivism could mean different things at different times. And I think it's right to stress that Coolidge's progressivism was very much, for the most part, oriented toward improving working conditions, health conditions of people in the factories. And I can give more examples later on, perhaps, if you want them. So it was a kind of attentiveness to bringing everybody into the commonwealth of Massachusetts, the common good being emphasized. And I think that was a significant progressive streak in Coolidge, which helped, of course, make him electable across party lines. And that's part of the mix that I think needs to be emphasized.
Yeah, I think it came through that this period of when Coolidge was coming of age, and then as he moved into the presidency, that the country was really sorting out what progressivism meant, and it was a bipartisan question. I guess the Democrats were wrestling with it, and the Republicans also. And Coolidge came up with his answer, which happened to be the more or less the final answer that the Republicans settled on. But it was a real debate about what did progressivism mean, and I think, as Chris said, it wound up meaning some things that are fairly surprising now as we look back on what we think of progressivism as.
George's remarks immediately rung true with me when you labeled Coolidge as a progressive himself, because I think he was. But a lot of this is definitional. Being able to claim progress as your mantle shouldn't require your opponents to say we're against progress. But that's the way it comes across. And in fact, the difference between Coolidge progressivism and, let us say, Wilsonian progressivism is not objectives, but means. It's the problem of the guy with the hammer who thinks that the solution is always, pound the nail. The hammer's the solution to everything. Government is the default solution to every problem in the progressive canon. Coolidge had a different approach. The other thing about George's paper that really struck me as ringing true is the impact that the dawn of the Soviet Union had on all of this, because it was, in essence, the limiting case. It showed, as it were, reductio ad absurdum, what happens when government is the solution to every damn thing, and the loss of liberty that entails, not to mention, just practically speaking, the loss of progress. In Garland's remarks, I also immediately agreed with your central point about the fluidity of political parties in American history. And in this stretch of 100 years that is supposed to be the continuation of this development, it's just hopscotch. We don't know from decade to decade what Republicans are going to be or Democrats. The continuity is lacking. But it is very much a function of individuals and individual choices. Our leaders and other people, journalists certainly included in this, have enormous impacts, and happenstance, as you remarked, has a big impact. Somebody dying at just the right or wrong time and being replaced by someone very different. So I am not one who believes in the trend of history. Historians always like to find patterns, as if you stand back far enough and it's like surveying a Seurat painting. You can finally see what all those little points mean. In my experience in government over 24 years in this city, the decisions of individuals matter most, and to a degree that it's almost frightening. Individuals truly matter.
Let me tell you my reaction to listening to these three presentations. We read about the progressive movement of the teens and the new nationalism and Wilson versus Taft versus, and it's all kind of very abstract and it's up there in the air. From these presentations, the decade comes across very, very different. It was a time of war, of revolution, the growth of radicalism in America, tremendous racial violence, and while there was a certain amount, the kind of the usual modicum of partisan rhetoric that we're familiar with in all epochs, this decade that feels in many objective respects like recent years in the United States. They even had a pandemic that was worse than ours.
A lot worse.
It did not lead to the sort of partisan polarization. In fact, people were changing parties. It did not lead to the sorts of violent, angry political positioning that we see in America today. In fact, the people that ended up coming out on top in the 1920s were people that had tried to moderate, to pick the best of the new impulses, to remain open, and what could have been a disastrous plunge into anarchy. We always say, well, it couldn't have happened because it didn't, and here we are today. But when I listen to these three accounts, it seems to me that after World War I and people came home, it was a time of a tremendous dissolution. And then we had an economic depression at the beginning of the 20s. Things could have turned a lot worse. And because this is a Coolidge conference, I want to say Calvin Coolidge was responsible for saving everything, and we'll give President Harding his due as well. But there was a spirit of the times that Coolidge seemed to me to embrace, that was able to cope with fissures and social discord and violence that we see today that seems to be lacking in our current politics.
Comments?
No, you can tell me I'm all wrong.
Well, the only thought that came to my mind, it's a bit different, was if you read anything about the Democratic Convention of 1924, I think you would agree that the politics were probably just as bitter, maybe even more bitter than they are today. But I agree with your conclusion that we were very fortunate as a country, leadership that came out of that. In the election of 1924, I mean, it's hard for us to visualize how significant the KKK was in the country, and it was a very big factor in the Democratic Party, and even had some influence in the Republican Party. And fortunately for the country, John Davis, the Democratic nominee, denounced the Klan, and if Davis had backed off or elected to soft pedal that issue,
right,
could have ignited a really bad scene. And of course, Coolidge moderation. In fact, La Follette was probably the worst and aggressive, but I think Coolidge and Davis provided very good leadership in pulling the country together. It could have really gone off the rails. KKK and prohibition was a hugely divisive factor too, and Davis and Coolidge both sort of downplayed that and didn't fan the flames.
To say a further word about 1919, we usually think of the Boston police strike as an extraordinary event, as indeed it was. But it was touch and go, and there were many other police unions in other places, or police organizations, that were watching carefully to see whether the police could win before Coolidge, finally, put a definitive stop to it, and not only by having the National Guard come in, but by his response to Samuel Gompers. And so if Coolidge had not been that, if he had been more conciliatory and said, well, let's negotiate or something like that, it's quite possible that there would have been copycat efforts all over the place. It was tinder dry in 1919. It was a year of record numbers of strikes, including a gigantic strike in the steel industry and the coal industry and so forth. And many people were worried whether this would just lead to upheaval after upheaval. And particularly in Massachusetts, which, as I mentioned, had a very heavy population of foreign-born. Coolidge was very sensitive to that, and both because he needed some of those votes to win, but also because I think his vision of progressivism was, and this only as a point that only came to me really yesterday thinking about it. I'll quickly share it. Maybe some will object or want to qualify. It's rather strikingly similar to Benjamin Disraeli's one nation conservatism that he propounded, or Tory democracy, in the 1860s. The idea being that Britain was one. It was not to be two nations, the rich and the poor, the have and the have-nots. Coolidge starts off that address, Have Faith in Massachusetts, with "It's a Commonwealth of Massachusetts is one," and then the next line is something to the effect that people of all classes, of all ranks, belong together, are in it together. That sense of oneness, I think, is something that Coolidge effectively appealed to. And again, of course, he did when he was defending the rule of law in 1919. But it goes also to the point that Chris was making, that what if Coolidge had lost the election of 1918? That was a narrow one for him, unusually. He usually won quite substantially. The Republicans had to call off their campaign convention and other things during the COVID, the influence of pandemic of 1918. And if Coolidge had lost the election, the Democrat running against him was a real demagogue, who, by the way, voted for Coolidge 2 years later. Again, all these switches of party. But anyway, if Coolidge had not won, it would have been quite interesting, maybe sobering, to watch what would have happened in 1919 without Coolidge, with his ability to communicate to the laboring classes and convince them that they're part of the common weal. All right? I think that's, it goes to your point that it's pretty fortunate that Coolidge got elected in 1918, even though the pandemic made it impossible for him to win with his usual majority.
Yeah, if we think about the progressive era as stretching from, say, 1896 to 1920, it was the worst of times for Black Americans. And the people who wrote history for years and years and years and years just overlooked this fact. So even Woodrow Wilson, or maybe especially Woodrow Wilson, in a speech to a women's group, talking about how things used to be and how they need to have the long lens of history and so on, mentioned that prior to the Civil War, we didn't have these kinds of problems because everybody was happy. And that may have been true if one overlooks a rather significant share of the population who were enslaved. At the same time, take then a look at what happened during the 1910s, during the peak, as it were, of the progressive movement, and it got worse and worse and worse until we get to the nadir, and we have what everybody now agrees is the worst time in race relations in American history. As I mentioned, and it's really important to stress this point, we've had race riots, throughout our own lifetimes. The unique thing about what was going on in the progressive era is that these race riots were almost exclusively white on black violence. Black people were begging to have law enforcement in their neighborhoods and so on. And it was just a terrible thing to see what happened when white union members went after Black Americans in East St. Louis, what happened in Chicago that Carl Sandburg wrote about, what happened in this city for weeks while the president did nothing. And in this city, armed forces, uniformed Navy personnel in front of the White House were, seen pulling people off of streetcars, black people, and beating them up and so on. It was just, it's remarkable what Coolidge had to remedy by the time he showed up. And then he goes to Howard University and he talks about the importance of getting rid of this propaganda of hatred and bigotry. Nothing like that happened in the Wilson administration, just the opposite. Coolidge deserves enormous credit for pacifying, to the extent it was possible at that time under those circumstances, the American public.
Chris, I understand that you are writing a book about Wilson. Is that
Yes,
correct?
Simon & Schuster. I heard on the previous panel that it is acceptable to hype your books.
Yes. Yes. Please flog away.
Q1 2024. It's called "The Light Withdrawn" from Simon & Schuster.
So you have this book that you've written on Woodrow Wilson, and George Nash is the author of the definitive biography of Herbert Hoover. These were two, and Herbert Hoover, of course, in the early 20s, in the late teens, early 20s, I think was probably much more famous than Calvin Coolidge. After the war, he organized a lot of relief efforts. We know that Wilson was a progressive, and we've heard a little bit about his progressivism. What do we know about specific influence that he had on Coolidge? Are there particular morsels? Would you call Hoover more of a conservative than Coolidge? Was Coolidge influenced by him at all? He called him the Wonder Boy. I know they didn't get along too well.
Right. Okay, well, Herbert Hoover was a Republican from Iowa, where as a boy he said the only Democrat in town was the town drunk. And then in the progressive period, he, like many American mining engineers, admired Teddy Roosevelt and his nationalism and so on, and became a Bull Moose progressive supporter. Hoover did. So he and Coolidge diverged in 1912, and they didn't know each other at that time. Then Hoover considered himself a Republican, but did nonpartisan war service as food administrator under Wilson and became close to Wilson for a time. Wilson finally cut him off when Hoover decided that it was better to accept the League with reservations than have the League go down, the Treaty of Versailles, and so they parted. Hoover called himself at the start of 1920 an independent progressive. He didn't like the Bryanite radicals of the left in the Democratic Party, didn't like what he called Republican reactionaries. I think he was thinking of some of the Senate boss type Republicans. He wasn't thinking of Coolidge. Harding liked Hoover and appointed him Secretary of Commerce. And when Harding died, Coolidge retained Hoover. And they initially got along. Hoover was very helpful to Coolidge. Hoover helped Coolidge defeat Hiram Johnson, militant progressive, in the 1924 California Republican primary. Johnson was challenging Coolidge, and Hoover sided with Coolidge. Their big point of agreement was on farm relief legislation. They objected to something called McNary-Haugenism legislation, and Hoover actually, as Secretary of Commerce, helped write Coolidge's veto of at least one of those two bills. So they had points of agreement, but Hoover got on Coolidge's nerves, and could go on and on about that. And in somewhat in annoyance, clearly late in the time, despite their correctness in terms of their dealings with each other, Hoover was Coolidge called him the Wonder Boy, and famously said, and everyone in this audience probably knows it, it was at the time of just before the Convention of 28, and someone went to Coolidge and said, "Can you say something favorable about farm reform along Hoover's lines?" And Coolidge said, "That man has given me unsolicited advice for 6 years, all of it bad." Which was not really accurate, although there were points of tension. But I have to remind this audience, because that quotation is often used as if that encapsulates the entire Hoover-Coolidge story. And it's part of the Hoover-Coolidge story, because Hoover was more liberal, progressive, sort of an assertive individual, an engineer. He had temperamental as well as philosophical differences with Coolidge. Nevertheless, Coolidge did, although he wasn't really fond of Hoover personally, he did his job as a party man, head of the party, and gave Hoover a raving accolade just before the election endorsement of Hoover in 1928. And again in 22, Coolidge, the party man, refused to be dragged back in to challenge Hoover himself and said he would not do it. He called Hoover safe and sound in print and did a speech at Madison Square Garden and a speech on the night before the election from Northampton, national radiocast, all giving his preference to Hoover over what he saw coming with Roosevelt. So maybe in summary, one could say Hoover was somewhat to the left of Coolidge, but he was to the right of Roosevelt, and Coolidge, whatever his private feelings about some of Hoover's pushiness as he saw it, nevertheless felt that Coolidge had to prefer Hoover as the head of the ticket, and in preference to the Democrats both in 28 and 32.
Good, thank you. It's time to move to questions from the audience. As at the first session, we're going to look for student questions. In my experience, the students that are associated with the Coolidge Presidential Foundation are not shy. They don't sit in the back quietly. They're willing to assert themselves. So please assert yourselves. I'll try to find you, and please wait for the roving microphone and introduce yourself. Let's start with this young lady here and this gentleman to her left. Okay.
My name is Lauralee Godfrey, and I'm from Portsmouth, New Hampshire. My question is for Mr. Tucker. You talked about political fluidity, especially in terms of the number of political ideologies and parties that abounded during the progressive era. Do you think that is good for democratic ideals, and do you think we should maintain our current two-party system?
Well, I think one of the points, I think what you're maybe referring to is that the fact that in the 20s, both parties were wrestling with progressivism. There was an active progressive wing in each party and a conservative wing in each party, and they were seesawing back and forth. And I think that was good for democracy, good for America, that the parties were wrestling with that. As I see it, the point I was trying to make is I think you can make an argument that the election of 1924 was really the beginning of the way we've seen the two parties divide. I agree with Chris, it hasn't been a straight line, but I think every election since 1924, the Republican candidate has been more conservative than the Democratic candidate. And variations have been different in years, but even in my lifetime back in the 60s, there was a substantial conservative wing of the Democratic Party that had more in common sometimes legislatively with conservative Republicans, and there was a liberal Republican wing that got along better with liberal Democrats than with the conservative Republicans. But over time, that's really changed. The migration of conservatives out of the Democratic Party into the Republican Party, and the migration of liberals out of the Republican Party into the Democratic Party has produced the polarization that we've talked about some this morning, and the polarization, I think, is a tough challenge to deal with, but it's just a fact of life that that's the way the parties have developed. So I think probably the thing that is good for democracy as we have it today is the middle section of the country tends to go back and forth, and the Republicans' more conservative view will come in, and then the next election or two, there's a swing back in the other direction. But the two parties since 1924 have generally distinguished themselves from each other, at least in economic terms, conservative versus more liberal or progressive. I think we've seen that continue. It doesn't appear that there's any less polarization now than there has been.
Just to tag on one additional thought, thinking of Republicans as conservative, particularly these days, requires you to embrace quite a lot. Conservatism this decade, conservatism the decade before, and so on, can't possibly be the same things. And one of the nuances that we need to pay particular attention to is that there's more than issues that divide these ideologies. There are also solutions. So prioritizing issues is an important thing. It might be, just take climate change as one example. These days, to be conservative, if I read the New York Times, I have to be a climate denier. I have to assume there's no such thing as science, and so on. But it might be that there are solutions to these problems that are market solutions. It might be that there are other approaches, and so on. So which issues are prioritized is, to me, equally important as the solutions. And once we identify which issues are important, if you watch MSNBC and then you watch Fox, or if you listen to Republican elected officials from Congress on TV, from the Democratic side, the Republican side, almost certainly they're talking about completely different issues because they like these issues and they don't like those issues. What really, really matters, I think, is solving these problems and not making the problems just go away. You gotta, and that's what, just taking us back to Coolidge. Yeah. That's what Coolidge was doing. He was saying, there's nothing wrong with the progressive agenda of issues. These are important issues, but ultimately he had different solutions for them. And then finally, on the question of is the two-party system superior, what it buys you is a way out of what happens in these parliamentary systems where there's a tyranny of the weirdest party on the extremes that get to broker who's in charge, and you get to have the government of Italy or Israel or what have you, where they have to contend with this all the time. I prefer our system.
Thank you. Matthew Tweeden from Austin, Texas, by way of UNC and Duke. I wanted to ask, almost in follow-up to this question, we see a very particular strain of New England conservatism today that in many ways can certainly draw ties to Calvin Coolidge. But I don't think it's a stretch to say folks like Governors Baker, Sununu, and Scott demonstrate very different tendencies from some of the more prototypical Republicans you might watch on Fox News today. Based on your reflections from this time period, I'm curious what insights you might have for the challenges facing a conservative movement in an era of big tent politics, party politics, that doesn't necessarily have as many of the defined features of parties seen in past decades.
Well, I think, as I intimated at the end of my own speech, without the trauma of 1919 and the strike, Coolidge would probably be remembered as a rather typical governor of a New England sort, as kind of a moderate conservative with progressive inclinations and some policies, and as the word I use was an incrementalist. In other words, he wasn't going to be a left-wing orator, demagogue type. And that's, in my own state of Massachusetts, in which I grew up, there are any number of Republicans who fall into that general category. Now, I'm not sure I can speak so much to the present as to how one deals with high tech or what other issues you were raising, but it seems to me that the Coolidge example can be brought forward. Coolidge was extraordinarily well prepared as a state legislator. That's one reason he got so high in the state Senate and got to be Senate president. He said he knew more about the bills than anybody else. And one reason he objected to bad bills was that all sorts of strange legislation was being proposed, and I think he got tired of reading about it and having to study up on it, and so on. So he was a minimalist in that regard. So I think if we're looking for analogies from then to now, what I might offer would be that I would like to have people who manifest competence and knowledge of issues as opposed to soundbite
Radical
certitudes. Okay. So Coolidge can speak to us that way.
Look over here. Gentleman, far back. Then stand up. Take 5 minutes to get
My name is Sabrina Maristella. Oh, it's okay. My name is Sabrina Maristella. I'm from Ashland and the Ashbrook Center. Thank you to the panelists and thank you to the Coolidge Foundation. This is wonderful. My question is about, I'm sorry, I couldn't see you very well. Someone mentioned that Coolidge sympathized with the highest aims of progressivism, and one of them being that we should use, or people should use, private property in service of the public. And I was wondering what exactly that looked like for Coolidge. And if you'll forgive me, I'm looking forward to the tax cuts that he'll champion later. So is that more of a moral duty rather than a civic duty? What exactly would that look like for him?
question.
Well, we can all address this. It is, of course, his Have Faith in Massachusetts speech, which is printed in the back of one of the books that you can get right out front. For Coolidge, private ordering was very important. And as I think in a very nuanced way we've heard this morning, he watched the progressive movement experiment, because it really was a large-scale experiment, with government controls of various sorts. The government controls, especially during World War I, were just extraordinary. Even in World War II, we did not do many of the things that Wilson did in World War I to take control of everything in the economy at the government level. And the shortages and the rationing and a lot of the strikes and a lot of the, I mean, for example, once the government nationalized the railroads and Wilson's son-in-law, who was the Treasury Secretary, got made Director General of the railroads, to go back to this question of civil rights, now the federal government owns Jim Crow on rail cars, right? And people say, well, surely the federal government's not going to continue doing what the southern states were doing, and the federal government persisted. So the notion that the way to achieve the result is to put the federal government in charge, what was not an automatic winner for Calvin Coolidge. He thought it was important that people serve society, whether they were running a corporation or whether they were running a government, and it was a moral duty of being a citizen. But he did not think that automatically, if you put this responsibility in the hands of the government, that now the problem is solved.
Thank you very much. Oh, sorry. My name is Nick Jacobson. I think all of your comments have made me reflect on how central race has been to American politics for, ever, basically, since the country's founding. And I'm curious, Dr. Nash, you talked a little bit about oneness, and I think a lot of you have commented on how to create unity, how to think about solving problems rather than issues. And I'm wondering what you think of Coolidge and what it was about him that he was able to build unity to the extent that he was in this time of unrest. And even though he himself gets kind of wrapped up in, of course, then Johnson Reed in 1924 and the immigration quotas that get established. So, partial victories here and there. And maybe as a fruit for thought, I'm wondering if any of you have read the Protestant theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, who in The Irony of American History wrote that, a book about fighting communism, that we should not frame the struggle against communism as that of a God-fearing civilization against a godless one, because to do so would overlook the flaws and dangers within our own society and efface the allure of communism in a struggling and beset world. So if you have reactions to that, it seems to me Coolidge had some kind of sense of that humility in that Niebuhr is offering, and how that might bring politics today together.
Okay, a good question. One reason Coolidge believed in unity was that he could see potential disunity all around him. That strike in Lawrence was a nationally celebrated strike. Some of you may know it was called the Bread and Roses strike. And so he was able, in his own quiet, so serious conciliatory way, to reach some kind of an outcome that was not revolutionary in the sense of violence on the streets and so on. I think one of the keys to Coolidge's success was that he was not a Boston Brahmin type of Republican. By that I mean Senator Henry Cabot Lodge was the dominating force in the party, but Coolidge was close to the other U.S. senator in much of his time, Murray Crane, from up in the western part of the state, Coolidge's region. And Crane became a kind of, I wouldn't say a mentor, but a kind of a patron of Coolidge in the early teens particularly. And Crane, by the way, was a very philanthropically minded individual. Coolidge thought the world of him. He wrote the introduction to a little biography of Crane that was published in 1926, just 2 pages. He just thinks very highly of Crane. I think part of the key to Coolidge's success was that he was not a wealthy man. He came from kind of rural, middle-class background, sturdy yeoman type background, but he had to get elected in a town initially, in Northampton, which had a lot of Irish votes, and he somehow hit it off with a man named James Lucy, who was a shoekeeper, as I recall, in Northampton, and who had kind of a little fan club, network of Irish Democrats. And Lucy liked Coolidge and told his friends to vote for Coolidge, and that seems to have made the margin for Coolidge's victory once or twice. So Coolidge had this kind of rapport, partly, I think, because he was so different. He was not condescending, he was not bloviating, he was not out being performative, to use the word that came up earlier. And I think a lot of people, including fair numbers of ethnic-minded ethnic Democrats by disposition, saw in Coolidge a man who was serious, conscientious, and honest, and not just one more politician, and certainly not someone who was looking down at them as newcomers. So Coolidge had that rapport, which partly I think comes from his background and in the developed philosophy that he had, that everybody has to be included, including the scrub maid. He got through or saw through a bill to have a minimum wage for women and various other things in Massachusetts. Always attentive to that side, and not against wealth, but wealth has its service obligations if you have that success. So he had that ability to in some way, it's almost uncanny, connect with that part of the electorate. So I think that's an important aspect of him to keep in mind as we apply whatever lessons we may today.
I'm going to make room for one final question before we adjourn lunch, and I'll go right to this.
Thank you. My name is Audrey Kamina, and I'm from California, though maybe I should move to DC at this point. And I just wanted to ask Dr. Nash really quickly. We're seeing again the rise of communism in popularity and just in popular culture as well as in politics. How do we defend the flawed but fundamentally good vision of democracy and its reality against the alluring specter of communism?
Coolidge attempted to do that in 1919 and 20 and in the early 20s by education. And he even wrote some articles that will sound rather controversial if you read them today in a magazine called The Delineator, in which he argued that one thing that has to be done for all these foreign-born people coming in who are susceptible to radical ideologies is to educate them, and even thought Americanism type American history should be put into foreign translation to reach these people. So that's a quick answer, and I hope someone else can add to what I've just said. Education for Coolidge was highly important in that period.
Just one comment that maybe to that and some of the other discussion we've had here. I think, to me, the defining part of Coolidge's legacy was his economic policy and what he really worked out with Secretary Mellon and seen in his tax policies, but he was relentless in pursuing the decrease of government involvement. But I think the key to his success was that he was able to somehow explain this to the American people, and I think he was able to explain it because he honestly believed it, that he thought it was a moral issue to reduce the size of government. There's an interesting editorial from the Washington Post in reaction to one of Coolidge's State of the Union addresses, and said, the Post was kind of marveling, said most politicians don't talk about economic issues in moral terms or reducing the size of government in terms of moral terms, but that's how Coolidge saw it and how he explained it, and he was able to get that point across that, as he said, he was not trying to save money, but he was trying to save people. He was trying to reduce the imprint of the federal government and give people more of an economic opportunity on their own, and he was able to get that message across.
Ladies and gentlemen, Matt Dennert is going to give us our instructions for lunch, which follows immediately. For now, please join me in giving a warm thanks to our three wonderful speakers.